Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. So how has 2025 begun for you? Are you still feeling optimistic about the year ahead? Are your New Year's resolutions standing firm, or have they already broken on the rocks of reality? Well, don't worry, things could be worse. And in this episode, we'll tell you how. As Donald Trump lays out his vision for changing the global map, we'll take a look at the prospects for the world in 2025. Later, we'll sit down with Pascal Lamy, who ran the World Trade Organization for almost a decade and now dedicates himself to promoting a peaceful world. But we start with Ian Bremmer, whose Eurasia Group produces an annual countdown for the top risks facing our planet. It's keenly anticipated by governments and strategists alike. Ian, thank you very much for joining the show. Now, last year, around this time, we had a wonderful conversation about your global risk predictions for 2024 in what you described as the Voldemort of years, the year that should not be mentioned because of all the terrible things that would happen. Looking back on it, I know a lot changes during the year and a lot of unexpected things happen, but how did your predictions compare with what actually happened in 2024?
We always keep our risks report up on our homepage all year long. And then we go back at the end of the year and want to see if we, call balls and strikes and see what we can learn. I would say that the top risks all came out pretty much exactly as we expected. I mean, we said very unpopularly, we said Ukraine was likely to be partitioned, heading towards that. That seems almost certain at this point. It's not what we want to see, but it's certainly where we think it's going. We thought the Middle East war was going to expand dramatically from where it was back in January. That's obviously played out over the course of the year, not just in Gaza, but also much more broadly in Lebanon and with the Houthis and the rest. And we thought this was going to be an incredibly divisive time inside the United States, the U.S. versus itself. And of course, we were this close to the U.S. president-elect being assassinated in the United States, and the level, the animus within the U.S. Politically, as the U.S. system is in many ways in crisis, has played out. I think the big thing that we were surprised by was just how much worse the Chinese economy turned out than we expected. We knew it was doing badly, but it's been a much deeper challenge. And that has meant, for example, we thought in 2024 that there was going to be a much bigger fight over critical minerals and supply chain, because the world is moving away from a free market towards more industrial policy. But you don't fight as much over critical minerals if nobody wants to buy them. And the fact is that Chinese consumer demand fell off a cliff. So, I mean, that as a risk, frankly, I think is a longer term concern. But looking in my rearview mirror, I wouldn't have put that in the list for 2024. And I would have put the China risk up a couple ticks from where it was in the report back last year. Also, I was particularly pleased that we listed U.S.-China relations as a herring. This was a relationship. You had, the balloon getting, knocked out of the sky, and you had Nancy Pelosi traveling to Taiwan. But actually, the last year of U.S.-China relations were far better managed by both the Americans and the Chinese, with 25 high-level channels of dialogue established between the two, kind of recreating the old strategic and economic dialogue, and even military channels. So no trust was built, but a level of stabilization in the relationship did play out over 2024, notwithstanding the fact that the U.S. didn't give away the store to the Chinese in any way. So it was one of Biden's few foreign policies that generally he got good marks from both Democrats and Republicans, Riz.
Well, Ian, one thing that struck me very much in 2024 is everyone talking about the divisions within the US, and that risk you had, the US versus itself, really stuck with me. I remember we talked about it. Did the election being so decisive in favor of Donald Trump really mitigate that risk?
I think it helped. I mean, it's so decisive is an overstatement. Trump did not get 50% of the popular vote. He got slightly less. So, that is not a country where the voters are telling you we all want Trump. That's not what America was saying. In fact, I mean, if you looked at elections all over the world, incumbents got hit everywhere. Kamala Harris actually performed better than most incumbents did. I mean, if you were an alien looking down on the world, you would have asked, why did Harris perform so well compared to all of these other incumbents? And it doesn't matter to Americans, obviously, given the outcome. And the answer, I think, is largely, number one, because the US economy was performing so much better than so many of those other economies coming out of the pandemic. And also because Trump was such a divisive character inside the United States. And you had people even going for third parties, which is very unusual in the US. I think the RFK endorsement meant a lot. In fact, I would say that RFK probably mattered more for Trump's election than Elon did, despite his $250 million, which, ain't nothing at the end of the day. But yeah, I mean, I think looking ahead to 2025, Riz, one thing that is really interesting is that these three big wars, Russia, Ukraine, Middle East, and the US versus the US, are all sort of ebbing, right? I mean, it's not like the Israelis have much else to hit in Gaza. And, we've got a ceasefire with Hezbollah that may not hold, but I'd be surprised if the war breaks out the way it did in the early days in the fall. Russia, Ukraine, I think there's a decent chance we get a ceasefire over the course of 2025, even though it's probably going to take a little longer than the 24 hours that Trump promised in his campaign. And the United States versus itself, well, even though it was a very close election, Americans do not believe it was rigged. They say it was free, it was fair, and Trump is their president. They may not like it, but he won. And so, I mean, his win was actually perceived as more legitimate than, frankly, by the Americans as a whole, than either Biden's or Trump's in the last two cycles. So, I mean, there are a lot of things to worry about in 2025, but the risks that were front and center for everyone in 2024 have actually receded.
Well, you gave me the considerations you'd put forward in looking at your 2025 risk. Let's go through the countdown, because that's always the fascinating part. Starting with number 10, which you describe as Mexican standoff. It seems that the US's neighbor is going to have a painful time in 2025.
Yeah, it's going to be tougher. I mean, look, the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, who is quite impressive in my view, she really doesn't want a fight with the United States. And she is looking to do things that will make Trump feel like he's getting a deal. In other words, she's going to try to appease him, right? I mean, I said this is about as dangerous as we've had a world since the 30s, and appeasement is the word of the day in how to respond to Trump for countries around the world. I've already seen this. I was in Mexico a few weeks ago, and they're trying to figure out how to hit the Chinese so they can take Chinese goods off the Mexican market and not have them pass through to the United States. They want to give that to Trump. They recognize they need to do more on fentanyl. They need to do more on their own southern border so fewer illegal immigrants come through Mexico to the U.S. They're prepared to do that. But AMLO had a pretty good relationship with Trump. He was on the left, but he was a populist. He was the same generation, kind of gruff, but engaging and charismatic. They liked each other. Sheinbaum is a PhD environmental scientist who graduated from Berkeley. And she's a woman. I mean, it would be hard for you and I to find a demographic that Trump is likely to consider more problematic than her. So they're not going to get on personally well. And there are a lot of demands being made by the U.S. The trade deficit is a lot greater this time around. The China issue is pretty serious and hard to resolve. So, and the U.S. is in a stronger position. So, and also interesting, the USMCA, which needs to be renegotiated, the Canadians coming in, the likely new conservative Canadian government, would be very happy to negotiate bilaterally with the U.S. and throw Mexico under a bus. So, look, I think Mexico-U.S. relations will eventually get to the right place, and they will figure this out. But 2025 is going to be choppier between these two than a lot of people are expecting.
Now, number 9 is an intriguing one. Ungoverned spaces. What does that really encompass?
Well, in what we call a G0 world, the law of the jungle, where you are moving away from international rule of law and common values and standards, you end up with a lot of places that people forget about that aren't really governed. Like Sudan, where 25 million people are living under humanitarian crisis, and over 8 million have been displaced. Like Yemen, like Libya, like Gaza, of course, and the West Bank, like big swaths of Ukraine that have been destroyed and mined, but a lot of Ukrainians and Russians are still living there. Like Haiti, right next to the United States, that no one is really doing anything about. There are Kenyans sent a few hundred peacekeeping troops, but the gangs have taken over, basically. Myanmar, with a big fight between a lot of ethnic minorities and a military junta that the Chinese are very uncomfortable about, but no one's able to stop the fighting. So what we're seeing is larger and larger numbers of people around the world that are living in functionally ungoverned spaces. And it's not one of the top risks in the world because, frankly, these places don't have a lot of economic importance and aren't critical for national security, but of the big powers. But they matter, and they're starting to matter more. There's also ungoverned spaces that aren't about individual countries, but are instead about, outer space and everyone launching satellites, but not having agreements about the rules of the road there, or under the seas. And, all of these pipelines and fiber cables that are getting damaged by rogue actors, some of whom are states, some of whom are non-state actors. So, as you see a breakdown of global governance, you see implications for public goods, both for individual human beings and for society as a whole.
Now, with artificial intelligence, I guess that was inevitable, going to be somewhere on the list. You've put number 8 as AI Unbound, which makes it sound a little terrifying.
I'm a big enthusiast about AI. I think it's incredible, the use cases that we're seeing growing every day for expanding human capital and also for improving industrial innovation in every sector in every country. So I think it's still undersold from that perspective, despite a lot of hype and a lot of froth. But I also know it's undergoverned. And this year, last year, there was a lot of focus on we need to prioritize this governance. The Brits, put their flag down and said we want to have an AI safety summit every year, and that's how we're going to make a difference. This year, they've rebranded it. It's now being called an AI action summit. That tells you a lot. The Europeans as a whole feel like they focus too much on regulation. They're being left behind in the AI race, and they want to spend more. They want to engage more, innovate more. The Americans, Trump is probably going to rip up the executive order on AI that Biden did with the 7 systemically important AI companies in the U.S. And the U.S.-China dialogue on AI, which was hard to get started and only in its infancy, is likely not to go forward in the Trump administration and its relationship with Xi Jinping. So you're going to end up with an AI arms race between the Americans and the Chinese, which will remind you of what we had with the Soviets before the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it's a lot faster moving. And you'll also have a lot of tinkerers and bad actors that will download their American or European chatbots, and they'll customize them without the safety regs that they have. We've already started playing with these internally for analysis. And we're seeing it's very easy to ask an AI bot today, how do you kill somebody with arsenic? It's very easy to figure out how one would go about assassinating a CEO. We're not trying to do that, but there are people out there that are, and clearly we're not going to have any governance until the crisis comes. And that's where we are on AI right now.
That's a terrifying thought, actually, where it could go. Now, with number 7, you have an interesting term, Beggar Thy World. What did that mean?
Beggar Thy World means that with the Americans who are looking to put tariffs on other countries and looking to force other countries to decouple their national security related economic investments from China, but the Chinese have an economy that is faring badly, and that the only part that's really producing is a significant export manufacturing sector, everybody in between gets squeezed. We're living in a world where everybody wants to do open business with the Americans and the Chinese, And that's becoming much harder as the Chinese and Americans export very different political and economic strategies that are exclusive. They're mutually exclusive. So it means that other countries are going to have a harder time, and they're going to have a harder time with economies that have not fully recovered from the pandemic, with higher interest rates and higher debt levels. We've already seen in Brazil, if you make a little mistake on your fiscal environment, your markets will take a hit, your currency will take a hit. The UK is suffering for this right now. The French government is suffering for this. The Canadian government fell because of this. It wasn't because of Trump. It was actually the fiscal crisis. And then Chrystia Freeland, the deputy prime minister, basically shooting Trudeau in the face. That is a challenge that lots of developing countries and advanced industrial economies are going to be facing that pressure in 2025.
Now, you've got Iran in there as number 6, Iran on the ropes. You see it as having weakened quite a lot over the past year, don't you?
I think I'm hard pressed to find a large country that has weakened more than Iran has. They've lost their empire. The axis of resistance has been basically destroyed by Israel with American help, and Assad by HTS with Turkish help. And so, I mean, that was the way they projected power. As someone who studied the Soviet Union in the late 80s through its collapse in 91, Iran to me right now seems to be right about 1989, when the Soviets lost the Eastern Bloc and they no longer had a credible story internally, economically, politically, or geopolitically for their own people. That's where Iran is right now. They have an 85-year-old supreme leader who is in bad health and hasn't declared a direct successor yet. There's going to be competition there. Certainly, the Iranians know how to repress their people, and I expect that they will continue to as their problems. But the Americans and the Israelis sense this weakness and may well be willing to help them along. I expect a maximum policy of pressure economically from Trump, and I expect espionage and sabotage and assassinations, attacks on critical infrastructure from Israel, and maybe the U.S. and Israel would even consider jointly attacking Iran's nuclear capabilities. So I don't think this is a 1991 moment. I'd be surprised if Iran fell the Islamic Republic in 2025. But I do think that Iran has become the largest risk in the Middle East this year going forward, which it certainly was not last year.
Well, Ian, with Iran, with its back against the wall and in such a difficult situation, what risk is there that it's an even bigger threat because it has nothing to lose?
I think the risk has been that they could mistakenly over-respond to a significant threat. Now, they haven't done that heretofore, Riz. As you know, the Israelis assassinated the political leader of Hamas in Tehran on the date of the Iranian president's inauguration. And one can imagine, if the United States, Trump's elected, he invites Netanyahu to come to his inauguration in Blair House, and the Iranians assassinate him on January 20th, I think the Americans would respond immediately. And Iran didn't. They didn't. They showed incredible restraint. And they showed restraint when they were taking direct missile hits from the Israelis. So, actually, I take your point, Riz, and certainly there are those that recognize that they're in trouble because they look so weak, that their deterrence is no longer effective. But the fact is, there's very little that they can do to effectively threaten Israel and the United States in this environment. They don't have their Axis proxies to do the dirty work for them. They can't even get weapons to Hezbollah anymore because Syria, which was where they were transiting, is gone for them. Israeli air defense is pretty impressive. It's not like Iran is just next door. It's unclear to me what they would do if they had that strategy.
Now, I'm guessing that Vladimir Putin was among those who would not have expected the situation with Ukraine to be going on for so long. We're into 2025 already. And you have number 5 as Russia still rogue. Take us through that.
Well, Russia was number 3 last year. So, the reality is that the Russia risk has gone down somewhat. I do think that the next few months are critical because as we get closer to negotiations, Russia and Ukraine will look to improve their position. And that, it's why Ukraine has now just opened a new offensive inside Kursk in Russia, in Russian territory. We just saw, I think it was 15 Ukrainians killed in Zaporizhia by Russian missile attacks, the largest number of deaths we've had in quite some time in Ukraine from such an attack. Civilians, we're going to see a lot more of that going forward. So that's dangerous. I do believe that, and I mentioned earlier, that a ceasefire is likely to be brokered by the Americans with some support from allies, including Emmanuel Macron. And I think when the new German government comes in, by the way, assuming Friedrich Merz is the chancellor, which is our expectation, that they will be very aligned with Trump and with Macron on this. But even if you get a ceasefire, that is not going to be a breakthrough settlement. And that's the beginning of negotiations, a ceasefire. And that means that sanctions are still on, Russian sovereign assets are still frozen, and there's going to be a lot of conflict between Russia and frontline NATO states. You saw them intervening in the Romanian election. You've seen them pay for acts of arson and vandalism and even attempted assassinations in countries in NATO, in Poland, the Baltics, the Nordics, and the rest. I expect that's going to continue. So I still think that a rogue Russia in alliance with North Korea, with some 10,000 troops on the ground fighting for them and dying for them, I think that this is a pretty dangerous environment.
Now, about 3 decades or so ago, the world got the word Reaganomics when Ronald Reagan was the US president. And you have at number 4, Trumponomics. So take us through that. That's going to be an interesting one this year, isn't it?
Yes, and Trumponomics is really about a Trump administration that is going to implement a lot of what they said they are going to implement. He is in a much stronger position. The Republicans, the GOP, are riding his coattails, not the other way around. He has appointed loyalists inside his administration, not like Republicans who are more loyal to the party his first time around. You don't have people like Mattis and Gary Cohn and Pompeo and Nikki Haley. That's not this group. And that means if he wants to put tariffs in, he's going to put tariffs in. And I think that, there's a Washington Post leak the other day that said, he's going to back off. He immediately posted and said, that's fake news. And I'm setting my tariffs up. We're going to have 100 executive orders to begin with. That's going to have economic implications for the world. That's going to be inflationary. He says he's going to get rid of a bunch of illegal immigrants. I expect him to deport 1 million people in his first year. It's not 15 to 20 million. But there are going to be labor costs for that. These people are, not only do they work at very cheap rates, but they consume in the United States, and they're taxpayers. Medicare, Social Security, local taxes, that money is going to be gone. And that will also be inflationary. It'll have an impact on growth. Now, there are things that Trump will do that will make the markets happy. So he'll roll back regulations, and he'll extend the 2017 tax cuts on corporates and on high net worth individuals. But I think most of that low-hanging fruit was already picked in his first term. And I also think the macroeconomic indicators are more challenging this time around. The multiples that corporate stocks are trading at of earnings are a lot higher than they were before, less sustainable. You've got higher interest rates. You've got more challenging debt levels. I just think it is going to be harder for Trump to get the juice in the markets and the growth from this type of politics that he had last time around. So Trumponomics strikes us as a pretty significant risk.
I wonder, Ian, how surprised you were when you heard recent announcements by Donald Trump talking about claims on Greenland, the Panama Canal, that Canada should be part of the USA and so on. These seem to a lot of people to be quite out there.
Yeah, he talked about the 51st state. He talked about that when he met with the Canadians in his first term. Didn't make as much news then. He's getting more play out of it now. He clearly is leaning into the more extravagant claims on these other countries. When you hear him talk about the Panama Canal and Greenland, he sounds a lot like Putin sounded talking about Ukraine in 2022, justifications for the attacks on Crimea in 2014. the referendum and the illegal annexation. So, I mean, not a great thing, but also, we've seen this. When Trump was president first time around, he promised the one thing he said all the time: we're going to build a wall, Mexico's going to pay for it. No one believed that. And Mexico did not pay for a wall. But Mexico did increase security on their own southern border that led to fewer Mexicans and fewer Venezuelans and others coming into the United States. And that was a win for Trump. So what Trump is doing is he's making these crazy demands and he expects to be appeased. And he's going to be appeased by the Canadians and the Panamanians. And they're not going to give him land, but they're going to do things that are going to make him happier, that he can say, see, I got this done and Biden couldn't because I'm stronger. So I'm not surprised at all. I think we're going to see a lot more of it, and it's part of the playbook.
And as you mentioned, Russia was in number 3 spot last year. This time it's US-China breakdown. So what are your expectations? Because there's been a lot of rhetoric around the US-China relationship.
Yeah, look, I mean, it is possible that we could see a breakthrough deal between Trump and China. He reached out to Xi Jinping and invited him to his inauguration. No American president's ever done that before. Elon Musk is the most powerful person around the administration. And he says, as you know, he says, has all sorts of horrible things to say about the British government, the German government, the French government. He's never said a bad word about Xi Jinping or about the Chinese dictatorship. So there are people that would like to do a deal. But I don't think the preconditions for a deal are there. I think that American demands around China on technology and on the trade deficit and on Chinese pass-through trade through Mexico, Vietnam, India, into the United States, you're going to see enormous pressure from the U.S. I think you're going to see higher tariffs from the U.S. on China in early weeks in the Trump administration. And I think what the Chinese are willing to do in return is just not enough to get to a deal. They'll buy some soybeans. They'll buy some Boeing planes if Boeing's actually making any. But, I don't think that they're going to get to yes. And absent that, you're going to be moving towards a trade war between the two largest economies in the world. So, that's not a Cold War yet. And it's certainly not a hot war. It's not a fight over Taiwan. But given how big these economies are, that got to number 3 on our list.
Well, at number 2, you have Donald Trump again from Trumponomics earlier on. You've now got the rule of Don. And I wonder where that will fit into 2025.
Yeah. And again, the rule of Don, we're talking about a president that has so much more power in the United States and internationally, and other countries and companies are going to have to respond. Look, we put this report out on January 6th. And I mean, literally within a couple of days of it coming out, we already saw this risk play with Mark Zuckerberg and Meta completely changing their business model to align with Elon and Trump. Now it's community notes and no more moderators and censorship. And instead it's all free speech. And he put a few posts out explaining why he was doing it. And at no point in the post did he say that this is the new model and we should be doing this. Why not just say, I'm doing it because Trump just won and I don't have a choice. It's the rule of Don. I mean, in the law of the jungle, it's a very dangerous place for a lot of people, but it's great to be apex predator. And the rule of Don is what happens to all sorts of other people that need to align with that. And it's a pretty big deal. I mean, you now have Elon Musk, is the most powerful member of the private sector in the world, and he paid $250 million for the privilege. He's now regularly on phone calls and in meetings with Trump and foreign leaders and CEOs. Now, I mean, if I looked at Modi and he brought Gautam Adani on a call like that, a meeting like that, we'd be saying, oh my God, this is a banana republic. What are they doing? And yet it's the most powerful country in the world. You can't call the most powerful country in the world a banana republic. What do? You appease it. You get in line. You spend some money on it. You get on to get along. And that is what this means. And especially because Trump was almost assassinated and he believes that his political enemies and the so-called deep state were responsible for putting him in danger. They want to send him in jail. They impeached him twice. He asked for more Secret Service support after they're calling him Hitler and a fascist. They refused. I mean, it's clear that he's going to use the FBI and other agencies to address that. And, if you're an American and you think that this is a guy that could investigate me and my family, you're going to start behaving differently. So that's why this is risk number two. And I mean, if you can get Zuckerberg to jump on a dime within a couple of days, there are a lot of people around the world that are a lot weaker positioned than he that are going to do the same.
But Ian, isn't the USA meant to be set up by the founding fathers as having different branches of government that basically provide checks and balances that stop this kind of almost dictatorial power coming into play?
Well, it's not dictatorial power because there are checks and balances. The U.S. is not about to become a dictatorship. In fact, I don't think the U.S. is even on a pathway to becoming Hungary in the near term. And the reason for that is because there's still a professional military, there's still an independent judiciary, no matter who appoints them, and it's still a federal system. Riz, elections in the U.S. are actually run by states. They're not run by the federal government. So Trump doesn't have ability to steal them. And so there are significant limits on what he can do. But, he can absolutely use his power and Elon's money to make life very uncomfortable for folks that don't say how high when he says jump. And that is just as true for Mark Zuckerberg as it is for the Prime Minister of Denmark. So, that's what we're seeing playing out around the world today.
I guess what we're seeing here is the risk of the powerful influence rather than the direct executive power.
That's exactly right.
Well, number one on your list here, Ian, this year is G0. And you wrote G0 wins. So what do you see happening there? I know you've talked about the law of the jungle having come into play.
Yeah, a G0 world is very different from the American-led order that many have discussed over the past decades. I mean, if I think about what the U.S. in principle has stood for since 1989, when the wall came down, it was collective security, it was free trade and architecture that supports it, and it was the promotion of democracy around the world. Now, the U.S. did not do that always consistently. It was frequently hypocritical. A lot of people criticized it. I'm not here to say that America's always right all the time, but that was the model that the United States was attempting to promote, and not only attempting to promote it, Riz, but was telling the Chinese, you need to accept that model for yourself. You're becoming more powerful. We're letting you into the global economy. We're letting you into the WTO, but you're going to have to become more of a democracy. You're going to have to accept rule of law. You're going to have to accept the free market and become responsible stakeholders in US-led multilateral architecture. And not only did China not do that, but it turns out that the United States is actively renouncing that order. It's the first time I've ever seen where a country that creates an order in its image decides that it's no longer interested in that order. And instead, the U.S. is actually taking on a worldview which is much more Chinese. It's much more transactional. It's much more about power. It's not about rule of law. Trump will do a deal with anyone. It can be a dictator. It can be right-wing, left-wing. It can be a Democrat. He's the guy that sat down with Kim Jong-un. It doesn't matter. But he's going to use his power to get a deal that he wants and that works for the United States. So, as I said, the law of the jungle, the powerful do what they will, and the weak do what they must. That was originally Thucydides, when we had a much less developed geopolitical environment, but it applies increasingly in 2025. And it's a very dangerous place to be if you're not the one that's throwing the punches. So everyone else is playing defense geopolitically, right? I mean, the adversaries of the U.S. are in a weaker position. China's economically, at least for now, but Russia in structural decline, Iran in real trouble, but also the allies. You look at South Korea, Japan, Germany, France, the UK, Canada. These are all countries that are not only in a weak position from a military perspective, from an economic perspective, from a technological perspective, but also their governments are quite weak. So, I mean, Trump's going to get a lot of wins in the early days, He's going to break a lot of furniture.
Well, Ian, it's a great list, and I'm wondering, as we wrap up, what about the red herrings and things that almost made the list, some that didn't, obviously? What you were also looking at over 2025's prospects?
We had a few. One was, despite the fact that the United States is less interested in leaning into climate change and responses to it, we don't think that the global energy transition is going to stall. The Chinese are actually the global leaders right now in transition energy, kind of like the way the US is on AI. And they see that as a huge advantage. They're going to throw an enormous amount of money at it. The Europeans are continuing. India, other countries in the developing world see that they need to for their own benefits. And even in the United States, Texas is the leader in producing renewable energy in the country. Red state Texas has overtaken California in the last couple of years. And so, big pieces of the Biden's Inflation Reduction Act will stay in place to help the energy transition because it's red state jobs. So we don't think that's going to go away. Europe is not going to fall apart as much as Trump might like it to. They've got a strong NATO Secretary General. They've got a strong EU leadership with von der Leyen, with Roberta Metsola, with Kaja Kallas. Macron remains strong on foreign policy, even though his domestic policy has imploded until at least 2026, when he has to look ahead to his own elections, which are in 27. And Germany, you're leaving a weak chancellor, and instead Friedrich Merz comes in, and he's much more aligned. So we actually think that the EU is going to stay together pretty well, despite all of the anti-establishment, Eurosceptic, and populist winds for change that are coming at the grassroots. And then finally, for all of those people in the US and around the world that think that Trump is incompetent, it's going to fail, we don't. We think that a lot of Trump's efforts, a lot of what Trump's promised to do in his campaign, he's actually going to get done, and he's going to have a lot of wins. He had a lot of wins in his first term. He had USMCA, he had the Abraham Accords. People said he never would have accomplished those things. He's going to have a lot of wins in the first year of his administration as well. Those are our red herrings.
Ian, always a real pleasure to speak with you and to pick your brains. Thanks for your insight on what may turn out in 2025.
Riz Khan, great talking to you, man.
Well, if that list of global risks facing the world has made you want to head back to bed and forget about 2025, let's hear a different perspective from a man who's determined to take on some of those challenges. The former head of the World Trade Organization, Pascal Lamy, refuses to abandon hope. As vice president of the Paris Peace Forum, he's a prominent voice among those promoting a more positive global solution. Pascal Lamy, thank you for the time.
My pleasure.
Let's start with your work with the Paris Peace Forum and look at the challenges, which are quite daunting, from climate change, terrorism, migration, and of course now the challenge of cybersecurity. Where do you start?
Well, what we're trying to do with the Paris Peace Forum, which we created with the French president in 2018, 6 years ago, is to adjust the way we handle international issues to the new realities. To put it very simply, in the old world, states, sovereigns were interacting, treaties, institutions, but they had a sort of monopoly of international relations. This system is not anymore fit for purpose, A, because the capacity to agree is much lower than it used to be because of geopolitical tensions. B, because most of the topics of today, take climate, take cybersecurity, take digital, take drug, take crime, are not just in the hands of sovereigns. Many other stakeholders, large multinationals, NGOs, cities, have an international cooperation capacity, which sometimes is higher than states. So if you want to get things done, you have to try and bring these people to the table with sort of purpose-led coalitions, which may not last 10 or 20 years, but which are better at getting things done.
You used a key word, capacity. From where will the resources come to even start to tackle these?
The good thing about what I call polylateralism as opposed to multilateralism, poly meaning with various actors, is that they bring their own resources. Companies, NGOs, philanthropy have resources which sometimes many states, including the poorer ones, do not have. So they bring resources, they bring expertise, and they bring energy. Their culture is much more often, let's sit around the table, we have a problem, let's try and find a solution together. And the Paris Peace Forum is a sort of incubator of these new coalitions. And incubating is a know-how which we've built and which, not always, but in many cases gives good results on the ground, which we can show do impact the way climate, digitalization, children on internet, or protection of the Southern Ocean can work.
Well, when you were heading the World Trade Organization, WTO, it seemed the world was globalizing. And I wonder to what degree is the promise of a collaborative and increasingly integrated world collapsing into a deglobalization now?
I would not agree with the fact that we've shifted from globalization to deglobalization. I don't think that's the case. We've shifted to a pattern of globalization, to another pattern of globalization, which is different. But if you look, for instance, at the main indicator of globalization, which is the volumes of world trade, they're still growing. So globalization, notably thanks to digital technologies, data transfers, is progressing, but it doesn't happen the same way as before. More regional action, Southeast Asia, the northern continent, Europe and Africa, and of course geopolitical tensions that in some cases are trumping the force of geoeconomics, such as, for instance, more protectionist policies in some sector or by some countries.
That's what I mean. You know, if there is increased trade, it doesn't necessarily happen at a global level. It could be more blocks and more regionalized.
Yes, and that's probably the case for some specific value chains. Okay. If you take the automotive sector, for instance, but it's not going to be the case for shirts or for wheat or for planes. If you look at the composition of international exchange, a lot of that remains really globalized, and many major international companies have a footprint on many continents.
Mr. Lamy, to what degree did COVID play a part in revealing, perhaps, maybe increasing, cracks in the system? What did we learn from that when it came to globalized integrity?
But I mean, in many ways, COVID was a big test and a big example of globalization. This pandemic, which in Greek means global, was worldwide. Now, the way we have reacted to that, yes, created differences, and at the time, we tried very much, including at the Paris Peace Forum, for instance, to avoid this turning into a new North-South divide. And the reality, retrospectively, is that industrialized countries did not do what they should have done in a globalized world, hence increasing this North-South fracture, which is there on climate, and which will probably be there on digital and cyber if we don't care enough about bridging these divides.
Now, one thing the Paris Peace Forum recognizes is that the world is turning inward. What do you think is a key reason for that?
Well, I think you're right. I've been involved in this international life for the last 35 or 40 years of my life. I've never seen a world in such a bad shape. I've never seen the world in such a mess. And if you look at numbers, the number of armed conflicts, which is one indicator is the highest since 1945. So this is a reality. We are in a world where geopolitical tension, sovereignty rivalries, starting with US-China, which is the big frame of all this, is moving ahead, and this is bad for development, this is bad for poverty reduction, this is bad for human condition overall, and those of us like me who are a bit of old monkeys have to try and bring a bit of our experience, I would not dare say wisdom, to move the things in a better direction.
What do you think is fueling the populism that is effectively undermining institutions and the well-established mechanisms that were providing at least some collaboration?
I think what's feeding populism is that our economic, social and political systems do not deliver what a large part of our population want. And it's all true that populist parties, populist movements, have been better than others at capturing new trends such as identity politics, negative reactions vis-à-vis migrants. The use of social networks has created clans and polarization. All these elements are together, and I think those of us who are not on that side of politics have to be better at understanding, innovating, and thinking ahead.
That leads me to ask, how has the growth of fake news and now the very convincing deep fake complicated your mission?
Undoubtedly, the proliferation of social networks and of internet has opened a space for negative grouping, for people who feel the same way to coalesce. Some say that's what happened when we started writing. This what happened when we started printing. It may take a few decades before the system adjusts, but clearly for the moment we are not where we should be, and I personally believe that, for instance, total anonymity on social networks is a recipe for trouble.
And even worse, in the days of printing, it still took time to distribute. Now it's all instant and it's global.
Absolutely.
I find the term that the Paris Peace Forum quotes, that peace is not just the suspension of war, is an interesting one at this particular time when we have two major global conflicts. We have the Russia-Ukraine axis, the Israel-Gaza, even wider axis now. What real danger do you believe they pose to the overall world order and stability?
I think, in a way, the conflicts you mentioned are classical power rivalries, like the one we had in the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, the fact that the world, at least for us Europeans, is back to where we were 70 years ago. I mean, Russia invading Ukraine is like Germany invading Poland. It's exactly the same thing. And for roughly the same reasons, something is happening in your neighbor which you want to control, and you send troops. So this is a sort of regression that does not fit with the world of today. And these new power rivalries make it more complex to address the real problems of today, which are not whether I should invade my neighbor or not, but whether we can address climate change, whether we can run a cyber security system, whether we can fight against pandemics, and whether we can educate people. This is the real thing, and this is why at the Paris Peace Forum we try to work on the roots of peace or war, which lie in human systems.
Has it surprised you to see how these conflicts have created a massive disruption in the global supply chains? We've got now flights being cancelled, we see ships stranded, we see a lot of a standstill on the world trade level.
This is absolutely correct, and it shows that whatever digitalization we are moving towards, and there's a lot of that, we still have physical infrastructure, seas, canals, ports, satellites, submarine cables, which are the infrastructures of the world of today and of tomorrow. There still is a physical routing of all this, which is prone to damage, war, and warfare.
Let me wrap up with a brief thought. Do you remain, with all this experience you have and wisdom, whether you like it or not, do you remain optimistic or not?
I remain optimistic with one element, which is science. Science is moving forward incredibly rapidly in many directions, which can and will probably help humanity. This being said, this science, as always, can have a huge benefit, but needs to be controlled, regulated, and if possible, not weaponized.
Pascal Lamy, I have many more questions, but next time, I hope. Thank you, sir. Pascal Lamy speaking at the Global Cybersecurity Forum in Riyadh and ending this show with at least some degree of optimism. Well, that's it for this episode. From me, Riz Khan, and the team, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.